of Susan Carney to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals with a vote scheduled at noon Eastern. A break for party caucus meetings from 12:30 to 2:15, and then debate on team. This is live Senate coverage now on C-SPAN 2.
Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Merciful God, our shelter in the time of storm, use our lawmakers to bring help to others, credit to themselves, and honor to you. Empower them to persevere through life's challenges, never forgetting that you continue to direct their destiny. Lord, guide them to be at peace with themselves, with others, and with you. May they strive to live for your glory, knowing that though your will may be hindered, it will ultimately prevail. Give them, and all of us who work with them, your strength to endure and your courage to triumph in things we attempt for the good of this land we love. We ask this in your righteous name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 17, 2011, to the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jeanne Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
following any leader remarks, the Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Susan Carney of Connecticut to be a United States Circuit Judge for the Second Circuit. There will be 2 hours of debate. Roll call vote on confirmation of the Carney nomination will begin shortly after noon today. There's a celebration going on in the rotunda, and we want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with that, so we'll hold the vote open and make sure that any stragglers can vote. Following the vote, the Senate will recess until 2:15 to allow for our weekly caucus meetings. At 2:15, the Senate will begin consideration of the motion to proceed to S-940, the Closed Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act, with 4 hours of debate. There will be a roll call vote at approximately 6:15 this evening on the motion to proceed to the bill with the 60-vote threshold. Additionally, the Senate will debate the motion to proceed to the Republican alternative to the Closed Big Oil Tax and Loopholes Act, which is 953, the Offshore Production and Safety Act. That will be tomorrow. There will be a roll call vote on the motion to proceed to that bill tomorrow afternoon. That also, of course, will have a 60-vote threshold. I'm told that H.R. 1231 is due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
H.R. 1231, an act to amend the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and so forth, and other purposes.
Madam President, I would object to any further proceedings at this time.
Objection having been heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
Madam President, as we learned today from articles around the country, and I'll refer just briefly to one USA Today, and I quote, as gas prices hover, near a $4 a gallon price, nearly 7 in 10 Americans say the high cost of fuel is causing financial hardship for their families, and USA Today Gallup poll finds. More than half say they've made major changes to compensate for the higher prices, ranging from shorter trips to getting back on vacation travel. For 21%, the impact is so dramatic, they say their standard of living is jeopardized. It goes on to indicate that the situation involving gas prices is very, very focused, and in the lives of some, drastic. Madam President, the other issue that American people face, and they should, is we have to do something about raising the debt ceiling. We can only do that, Democrats, Republicans, and independents agree, by doing something about bringing down the deficit. And it has to be something that's meaningful. A place to start in that regard would be to focus on these gas prices, how concerned people are, and, in addition to that, the deficit. We have a bill that we'll vote on this evening that says the subsidies given to oil companies, the 5 big oil companies, last quarter, which made $36 billion. That's net profit. We're saying that those subsidies are no longer necessary. We've had, over the years, a number of executives from these companies who said they're not necessary. And they're now trying to justify these. Well, if we don't do this, it's going to cause gas prices to go up. We had a report by a Congressional Reference Service independent body who quoted in 3 different places in that report that it won't affect gas prices at all. They said it in different ways, but they said it. So number one, of course we have to do something about the exorbitant gas prices, and the best way to start with that is to do something about the 5 big oil companies getting subsidies they don't need. And the other way to do it, the other thing we have to be concerned about are the huge deficits we've had. And we can accomplish both of those to some degree today by doing something this evening when we vote on taking away those huge subsidies that the oil companies no longer need.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Last week, as gas prices continue to climb, squeezing family budgets and putting more pressure on already struggling businesses, Democrats here in Congress sprang into action. Instead of actually doing something about high gas prices, our Democratic friends staged what one of my Republican colleagues accurately described as a dog and pony show. They rounded up what they believed were a few unsympathetic villains who they could blame for high gas prices, hoping nobody would notice they don't have a plan of their own to deal with those high gas prices. That's been the Democratic strategy from the beginning. Blame this crisis on somebody else and see if they can't raise taxes while they're at it. They've been so shameless about it, in fact, that they haven't even pretended they're doing anything to lower gas prices, readily admitting the bill we'll vote on today won't lower gas prices by a penny. As the Democratic chairman of the Finance Committee put it just last week, that's not the issue. Well, I would submit that for most Americans, high gas prices is, in fact, the issue. And this week, Democrats will show once again how little they care about it when we take up an energy plan that several more of them have admitted will do absolutely nothing to lower the price of gas at the pump. One Democratic senator, a member of their own leadership team, called the bill a gimmick. Another Democratic senator called it laughable. I would also argue that with Americans looking for real relief, symbolic votes like this that aim to do nothing but pit people against each other will only frustrate the public even more. Americans really aren't interested in scapegoats. They just want to pay less to fill up their cars. That's why this Democratic bill to tax American energy is an affront to the American people. And so is the President's announcement over the weekend that he now plans to let these same energy producers lease lands throughout the U.S. that his administration had previously blocked off. Now, the administration knows perfectly well that leasing, the act of leasing, is just the start of the development process, which is why its only hope is that the American people don't pay close attention to the details of the plan. Permits, Madam President, permits are what really matters. And by refusing to issue permits in any meaningful way, the administration is showing its true colors in this debate. If the administration were serious about increasing domestic energy production, it would increase leases and, most importantly, it would increase permits. In the end, the only thing Democrats will actually achieve this week is to make Republican arguments for comprehensive energy legislation seem even stronger than they already are. By pretending to want an increase in domestic energy production, the President is not only acknowledging that the U.S. has vast energy resources of its own waiting to be tapped, he's also acknowledging that tapping these resources would at some point help drive down the price of gas at the pump. Now, that's what Republicans have been saying all along. Now the President is acknowledging that. Supply matters, and American supply matters even more. So the only thing that seems to be standing between Republicans and Democrats at this point is the Democrats don't seem to have the political will to follow through on their conclusions. And in this, today's Democrats are no different from their predecessors. Literally for decades, Democrats from Jimmy Carter to President Obama have sought to deflect attention from their own complicity in our nation's overdependence on foreign oil. Every time gas prices go up, they pay lip service to the need for domestic exploration while quietly supporting efforts to suppress it. But President Obama's energy policy puts the current administration in a whole new category. Over the past 2 years, the President has mounted nothing short of a war on American energy, canceling dozens of leases, imposing a moratorium off the Gulf Coast, arbitrarily extending public comment periods, and increasing permit fees. On the crucial issue of permits, the administration has held them up in Alaska, the Rocky Mountain West, and particularly offshore. Every one of those decisions has had a major impact on future production and on future jobs, since every permit the administration denies is another job creation opportunity denied. So the truth of the matter is the Obama administration has done just about everything it can to keep our domestic energy sector down and to stifle the jobs that come along with it. Until now, the President has stuck to attacking Republicans for being stuck in the present without preparing for the future. But this has always been a disingenuous argument. It ignores history, since we have repeatedly supported alternative fuels and renewable energy as well as comprehensive energy legislation that commits us to the development of cleaner technologies. And it ignores science, since even if 1 million electric vehicles are sold here by 2015, they'd still only account for less than 0.5% of the entire U.S. vehicle fleet. However much we desire it, the transition from oil will take decades, and serious energy policy must account for that. With this latest gambit, the President may have acknowledged the wisdom of our approach, but his plan to allow a few lease sales without corresponding permits falls short. Energy producers might end up with a lot of expensive land, but the rest of us would have nothing to show for it. A better approach to this crisis is the Republican alternative that we'll get a vote on tomorrow. Our bill would return American offshore production to where it was before the administration locked it up, require federal bureaucrats to process permits, to make a decision one way or the other, process the permit, make a decision one way or the other, rather than sitting on the permit. And it would improve offshore safety. Our plan not only acknowledges the importance of increasing domestic production, it does something about it while ensuring environmental safety. If President Obama and his party are really serious about lowering gas prices, making us less dependent on foreign oil, and creating the thousands of jobs that American exploration is proven to produce, they would embrace our plan and stop pretending to care about a crisis they have done so much to create, and their latest public relations efforts notwithstanding, continue to ignore. Now, Madam President, on another matter, this week we commemorate National Police Week 2011 and honor the service and sacrifice of the many men and women in federal, state, and local law enforcement across America. Washington welcomes thousands of police officers who have come to celebrate National Police Week. They will honor their fallen fellow officers and rededicate themselves to their mission of serving and protecting their neighbors and their communities. Among the visitors are hundreds of officers from my home state of Kentucky. I want to personally welcome them to the nation's capital and express my gratitude to them for bravely laying their lives on the line to protect towns, small and large, all across the Commonwealth. Approximately 900,000 peace officers are serving today across our country. Every year, between 140 and 160 of them are tragically killed in the line of duty. 2011 is already proving to be a difficult year, as 69 law enforcement officers nationwide have been lost in the line of duty so far, compared with 59 at this point a year ago. To recognize those peace officers who have lost their lives in the line of duty and their loved ones, I was pleased to co-sponsor a resolution designated May the 14th, 2011 as National Police Survivors Day. This resolution, which passed the Senate unanimously, calls on the nation to honor the families of fallen law enforcement officers and to pay respect to the courageous men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice while serving to keep our communities safe. In my state, in the town of Richmond, the Kentucky Law Enforcement Memorial Monument stands as a permanent reminder of the high cost of protecting the peace. At a solemn ceremony last week, 24 names were added to its rolls, bringing the total to 485. I know my colleagues will join me in saying the U.S. Senate has the deepest admiration and respect for police officers in every community across America. We recognize theirs is both an honorable job and a dangerous one. They bravely risk their lives for ours. America appreciates everything they do, and America is grateful to them and to their families. Madam President, I have here a list of 24 names that were added to the Kentucky Law Enforcement Memorial Monument this year, and I ask unanimous consent that the names of those heroes appear in the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
I request the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Susan L. Carney of Connecticut to be United States Circuit Judge.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 hours of debate, equally divided and controlled between the Senator from Vermont, Mr. Leahy, and the Senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley, or their designees.
Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum, and I ask that the time be charged equally to both sides.
Without objection. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Connecticut.
Thank you. Madam President, I rise today to voice my...
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I am sorry, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to voice my strong support for the nomination of Susan Carney to serve as an appeals court judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, one of our most distinguished appeals court panels among the Federal Circuit. And I hope that the United States Senate will move swiftly to confirm her to fill one of the open seats on this critically important court. Ms. Carney has truly impressive credentials for appointment to the federal bench. She graduated cum laude from Harvard College in 1973 and magna cum laude from the Harvard Law School in 1977. And she then went to clerk for Judge Levin Campbell on the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. She currently serves as Deputy General Counsel for Yale University, one of the country's great institutions of higher learning, and previously served as an Associate General Counsel for Yale. In her capacity at Yale, she advises the university on a wide range of legal issues, some of them complex and challenging, relating to intellectual property, international transactions, and commercial matters. Ms. Carney's time at Yale has exposed her to a broad array, a diverse swath of federal law, giving her a breadth of experience that truly qualifies her to serve on the Second Circuit, which handles federal appeals on legal issues arising within New York, Vermont, and Connecticut. In various matters, Ms. Carney has advised Yale in reaching very successful results, and that experience will serve her well on the bench. Her experience as an advocate has given her a perspective that will give her the kinds of qualities, a respect for other advocates who come before the court, a respect for the legal principles at stake, for the factual findings of courts below, and of all of the considerations that are so critically important to ability and integrity on the Federal Court of Appeals. She spent 17 years working as a private practice attorney in Washington, D.C. and Boston. And there, too, she represented a wide array of clients on major issues, including, for example, the Major League Baseball Players Association and a Tennessee union that stopped work due to its employees' exposure to uranium. In the Tennessee court, the NLRB determined that striking employees could not be replaced, and the D.C. Circuit issued a similarly positive verdict. As impressive as her commercial and private litigation is, her commitment to pro bono public service work. She engaged in such work throughout her time as a lawyer, offering free legal counsel to pro bono clients, and even volunteering as a tutor. Her commitment to the community, as well as appropriate legal representation for all clients, demonstrate a real respect for the legal system and the fairness, the fundamental fairness of the legal system that I believe should be and is broadly shared by members of the federal bench. Her nomination comes at a particularly pressing and challenging time for the Second Circuit. The vacancy that she's slated to fill has been designated as a judicial emergency. The vacancy has existed since October 10, 2009. There are 2 open seats on this court from Connecticut, which is currently more than 15% understaffed. So the arrival of Susan Carney, the Second Circuit, will have immediate impacts. It will help immediately to address the understaffing problem and the work burden that has accumulated as a result of it, and it will ensure that this caseload can be addressed quickly and efficiently. We hear in this body the famous saying that justice delayed is justice denied. Truly, it is often justice denied if it is delayed. And in practical circumstances, people have a right to their day in court, which includes a day in the Court of Appeals. In the federal courts, that appeal is generally one of right. It is not discretionary. And to deprive people of that right is truly a denial of justice. I've been impressed since I have come to the Senate by the good faith that has been shown by both sides in working to address this growing judicial vacancy issue. Some have thought it an epidemic. In many circuits, it's been characterized as a judicial emergency, and it has been spurred by respected figures from across the spectrum, from Chief Justice Roberts to Attorney General Holder, and the Senate has been moving very responsively and responsibly to address this issue, and I'm hopeful that this nomination of Susan Carney and others that will follow, as some have preceded it, will lead to a new era in addressing the judicial vacancy problem throughout our federal courts. The American people expect us to work together, just as they expect the courts to give them justice. And so far, I've been encouraged to see members of both parties working in the Senate to act expeditiously on these nominations, some of them very long delayed. And I hope that the Senate will continue this trend with the swift confirmation of Susan Carney to the Second Circuit. On the issue of emergencies, I'd like to address a second topic, Madam President. Over the last decade, what we've seen is a pattern of rising profits on the part of oil companies. The emergency for consumers is one of rising prices now. And I believe that we have an obligation to assure fundamental fairness in our tax code by eliminating, in effect, the tax subsidies and loopholes and giveaways that are such an offense to the justice and fairness of our system. In spite of the big five oil companies earning more than $1 trillion in profits, they have enjoyed tens of millions of dollars in these taxpayer subsidies. They are unconscionable. They are unacceptable. They must end. And that is the purpose of the legislation that we are going to consider later today. I strongly support it in the interests of consumers, but more important, in the interests of taxpayers, to repair a part of our deficit. While families and businesses in Connecticut are paying more than $4.25 a gallon, putting a strain on all of our family budgets, the big oil companies continue to rake in these record profits and continue to enjoy subsidies that put a dent in our fiscal situation. The companies make over $30 million in profits in the first quarter of this year alone, representing a 50% increase in profits from last year. The long and short of this debate is that big oil doesn't need these subsidies. They don't need the help of American taxpayers to do exploration or any of the other activities that are involved in producing the profits that they enjoy so abundantly. Ending these subsidies, despite claims to the contrary, will not increase prices at the pump and instead will provide for basic fairness so that Americans no longer have to pay for these giveaways and tax breaks to some of the most profitable companies in the world. People in my home state of Connecticut and across the country remain concerned about reducing our debt and our deficit. We can't do it if we have this plethora of subsidies and giveaways and breaks to special interests and corporations like big oil that simply don't need it. Ordinary Americans in Connecticut and elsewhere are struggling to stay in their homes, find jobs, keep their families together, and they regard these subsidies as offensive to fundamental fairness, and they are right. And I urge this body to act later today in eliminating those loopholes and subsidies. I thank you, Madam Chairman.
Madam Chairman.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam Chairman, it's my understanding that I have 10 minutes as if in morning business. I would make that request.
Without objection.
Madam Chairman, first of all, we are going to be voting apparently this afternoon on a bill to dramatically increase taxes on America's oil and gas companies, and I would only suggest that it's not going to pass. I can recall when the senator from Vermont just a few months ago had a bill that would have done essentially the same thing, passed the tax increases on these oil and gas companies. I remember coming to the floor at that time and giving the argument against it, and in the end, it ended up we had a vote on it, and the vote was I had 61 votes against it to 30, whatever it worked out, that were for it. And afterwards, I have to say this about Senator Sanders. He came up and said, you know, I think that was probably one of the healthiest debates and more honest debates that I've seen during the years I've been in the United States Senate. And I agreed with that. It's just that the idea that you can somehow tax these people and accomplish something. Let me just say that the Congressional Research Service, when you talk about the CRS, that's nonpartisan. It's something that nobody argues with. They look at us. We in the United States have the largest recoverable reserves of oil, gas, and coal of any country in the world. There's no reason in the world we can't be completely independent of the Middle East. All we have to do is exploit our own resources, oil, gas, and coal. Now, the same Congressional Research Service has looked at the issues and has told us that raising taxes on energy companies will do two things. It'll decrease supply. It'll increase dependence on foreign countries. In other words, this vote that we're going to have this afternoon, if it were successful, that would decrease the supply and increase our dependence on the Middle East. Now, in addition to the CRS, let's go back to the 1970s under the Carter administration when they had the windfall profit tax. In the windfall profit tax, the same exact thing happened. They decreased supply and increased dependence on foreign competition. So, you know, and the interesting thing, that I know my wife's not the only one complaining about the price of gas at the pumps, but she's certainly very loud and clear in that position. Nobody is saying that by increasing the taxes, the vote we're going to have this afternoon on oil and gas companies, that somehow that's going to have the effect of lowering prices at the pump. It will raise prices at the pump. In fact, I think several of the members have come down. Senator Menendez, sponsor of the energy legislation, he said, quote, nobody has made the claim that this bill is about reducing gas prices. Well, if it's not about reducing gas prices, what is it for? And the answer to that one is they say, oh, it's, as the gentleman, the senator from Connecticut just stated, this is going to be something that is going to be reducing the deficit. Well, our problem is President Obama and his Democrat support in the House and the Senate. The first 2 years, he had a large majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate. They increased, in his 3 years of budgets, the deficit by over $5 trillion. I can remember going to the floor of the United States Senate back in 1995, back during the Clinton years, and saying, this is outrageous. This is a $1.5 trillion budget. That was the budget to run the entire United States of America. This last budget by the President Obama was an increase of $1.65 trillion, just the deficit. Just the deficit. Now, let's do our math. 365 days in the year, it works out to be $4 billion a day. We have a president and his majority giving us a $4 billion a day deficit, and this says it's going to cut the deficit by $2 billion. So we can tax all these oil companies, come up with enough money to reduce the deficit by $2 billion. That's worth 1/2 day's deficit of this administration. I know that the majority of people understand that, and they're not going to be duped into doing it. By the way, I have to say that fortifying me was this morning's editorial in the USA Today. They talk about how ludicrous this whole idea is that you can increase taxes on oil and gas companies, and they say, quote, it's an example of the sort of political gamesmanship that substitutes for serious deficit reduction. They go on to say, but in the initiative, is also government at its arbitrary worst, further complicating the tax code by singling out 5 companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Shell, and BP, for special taxes not paid by smaller energy concerns. So we have a little class warfare going with it. It's interesting because only yesterday the same USA Today was criticizing me and their editorial policy because I don't want to pass a cap-and-trade a tax increase. And so the same paper that yesterday was critical of a position that I've taken is now very strongly in position of the position I've taken in avoiding any additional taxes on the energy or anybody else. Now, the last thing I would say, because I am going to stay within my time frame, is that people say if you want to do something about the deficit, that's what they're saying they're doing. This is 1/2 day's deficit they're taking care of here if they pass these tax increases, which they won't. But they say that there are only 2 ways to handle this, the debt. That one would be to decrease spending and the other increase taxes. I suggest there's a third way, and that way is to go after all these regulations that we currently are operating under right now as a result of this administration. We're talking about cap-and-trade regulations, greenhouse gas regulation, boiler MAC regulations, ozone. The ozone could create over 600 non-attainment areas. The cost of that is $90 billion. If you add up all of the costs of all of these different regulations, greenhouse gas regulations, $300 to $400 billion a year, ozone, some 60 to 90 billion, boiler MAC, $1 billion, utility MAC, $184 billion. Add it all up, it's $1 trillion. Now, if you take the $1 trillion, that is 7% of the $14 trillion that we would say the GDP would amount to. Now, what they say, and CRS says this also, for every 1% increase in economic activity or increase in GDP, that translates new revenue, $50 billion for each percent. This is 7%. That'd be $350 billion. If you want to go after the deficit and after deficit spending in the debt, let's go after the regulations too. Don't let them out. But to think that we can tax oil and gas companies and somehow come up with $2 billion to reduce the deficit, that's 1 day's deficit under the Obama administration. And this body's not going to pass it. With that, I'll yield the floor.
The senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I congratulate the senator from Oklahoma on making a perfectly obvious and compelling point, which is if the problem is high gasoline prices, then why is the Democratic solution to raise them more, which is all that their tax would do? The Republican plan for dealing with high gasoline prices is to find more American energy and use less. The Democratic plan seems to be to find less and tax more. That's not going to solve the problem. We need to use less. We agree with that. And there are a variety of ways to do that through conservation, electric cars, which I favor, finding research for crops, for alternative fuels from crops that we don't eat, all that. But more importantly, we need to find more American energy and natural gas offshore, on federal lands, and in Alaska. That won't completely solve the problem of high gasoline prices, but it will help. And if less oil from Libya is a factor in raising gasoline prices, more oil from the United States would be a factor in lowering gasoline prices. we still, after all, are the third largest producer of oil in the world. So I thank the senator from Oklahoma for an excellent point. The Democratic proposal is to find less American energy and to tax more. Now today, Madam President, I'd like to talk about another subject. I'd like to speak about the events of the last few weeks that have followed the decision by the National Labor Relations Board Council to file a complaint against the Boeing Company, alleging basically that the fact that they're expanding their production of airliners at a new plant in South Carolina, which is a right-to-work state, is prima facie an evidence of an unfair labor practice. This, in effect, establishes for the first time since the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947 the idea that it is against the federal law for a company that is producing in a union state to expand its facilities in a right-to-work state, of which there are 22. What we're talking about is the first new plant in 40 years to build large airplanes. The Boeing Company builds most of its planes in Washington State. It's the nation's largest exporter. It has 170,000 employees around the world. 155,000 of them are employees in the United States. These are good jobs. But at the hearing on Thursday, the general counsel of Boeing said that Boeing expects to lose the appeal of the general counsel's, the decision of the general counsel when it's heard before an administrative judge on June 15. And then they expect to lose the appeal of that decision to the National Labor Relations Board because he assumes that the general counsel is following the same view of the law that the President's appointees on the National Labor Relations Board are following. And then he expects to win the case when it goes to the United States Court of Appeals or perhaps even to the Supreme Court. But that takes, Madam President, 2 to 5 years for all that to happen. So I ask, what happens to American jobs in the meantime? Well, first, this complaint against Boeing will slow the number of good new jobs into my state of Tennessee, which has a 9% unemployment rate and has had for 2 years. I've watched our state grow over the last 30 years from the time I was governor. We had a hearing last week that Senator Harkin called, chairman of the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, about middle-class incomes. And what I said at the hearing was the effect on middle-class incomes in Tennessee, the state I know the most about, is that 30 years ago, we were the third poorest state. And then because the auto industry chose to come to our state, partly because it was a central location in the population market, and partly because it's a right-to-work state with a different sort of labor environment in it than other states, because the auto industry came to Tennessee, middle incomes have gone up. A third of our manufacturing jobs in our state are now auto jobs. Nissan is there. General Motors is there. Volkswagen just came there. Hundreds of suppliers have come to Tennessee. They like the environment. They like the road system. They like the central location, but they like the right-to-work law. And for suddenly, any supplier or any manufacturer who wants to create a new facility in one of the 22 right-to-work states, including Tennessee, according to this council, is going to have to think twice, because that company, which could be a small company, may not want to spend 2 to 5 years before the National Labor Relations Board. So I think this council knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to freeze job expansion in the United States at a time when we need job expansion in the United States. But, Madam President, there's an unintended consequence to this. If jobs can't move into Tennessee and other right-to-work states because of the Boeing complaint, they may not move into the states that don't have a right-to-work law. And why is that? Well, according to Jim McNerney, the CEO of Boeing, he says an unintended consequence, he means of the Boeing complaint, is that forward-thinking chief executive officers also would be reluctant to place new plants in unionized states, lest they be forever restricted from placing future plants across the country. So if you want to put a plant in, say, Michigan, which is a unionized state, you might not do that because under the general counsel of the NLRB's rule of law, you then could move to South Carolina or to Tennessee or to Arkansas or to any other state with a right-to-work law. Well, if you can't go to a unionized state and if you can't go to a right-to-work state, then where do you go if you want to make things? You go overseas, Madam President. This action by the NLRB General Counsel is the single most important action that I can imagine that would make it more difficult to create good new jobs in Tennessee and that would make it more likely that manufacturing jobs would go overseas. Madam President, the President of the United States asked the Chief Executive of Boeing, Mr. McNerney, to chair the President of the United States Export Council. I presume what President Obama would like for Mr. McNerney to do is to export airplanes, not export jobs. But what the NLRB ruling will do is cause the export of jobs, not the export of airplanes. Boeing has 170,000 employees. Most of them today are in the United States. But Boeing sells its airplanes everywhere in the world. And Boeing can make its airplanes anywhere in the world. And so there may be other countries who come to Boeing and to other manufacturers in the United States and say, we want you to make in our country what you sell in our country. And after this NLRB decision, they may be more tempted to do that. Now, fortunately, there are other trends suggesting that manufacturing companies around the world may be more likely in the next few years to make here what they sell here in the United States. That's what President Carter said to us governors 30 years ago. Governors, go to Japan. Persuade them to make in the United States what they sell in the United States. So off I went to Tokyo, and I asked Nissan to come to Tennessee, as did most states. They chose us because of our central location and our right-to-work law, just like many other auto jobs have done that. And now Nissan tells me that soon they will be making 85% of what they sell in the United States. They'll be making it in the United States. 30 years ago, they were making almost none of what they sold in the United States. Here in the United States, they were making it in Japan. We were worried then Japan was going to take us over, but that's changed. Now they're making here what they sell here. The Economist article this week says that there may be a manufacturing renaissance coming. That what's happening in China, where they're making things today, is a lot like what happened in Japan 30 years ago. As China becomes more prosperous, wages will go up. As Japan became more prosperous 30 years ago, wages went up. And so in the auto industry, wages only constitute maybe 70 or 20% of the total cost of what a supplier may have to spend in order to make a part for a Volkswagen assembly plant. Wages get to be less important, and people look at other things. And so manufacturers would look at a variety of actions by a government before the manufacturer decides where to make the airplane, or where to make the car, or where to make the appliance that might be sold in a country. Well, they're going to have plenty of incentives, naturally, to make a lot of things in the United States because the country that produces 25% of all the money in the world, which we do, is going to be buying a lot of stuff, unless we do our best to throw a big wet blanket on making here what we sell here, which is precisely what this administration has been doing. We have a high corporate income tax. Now, give the President the credit. He said, well, maybe we want to change that. Well, we should, because it makes it better for manufacturers to make things overseas. The health care law takes the profits away from companies that they might use to create new jobs here. I've had heads of restaurant companies tell me they're not going to invest anymore in the United States because the health care taxes take away all of their profits. Regulations that make credit harder to get. Regulations that drive up energy and gasoline prices. All of this makes it harder to make here what manufacturers sell here. And now we have a regulation from the National Labor Relations Board that may have the effect of law for 2 to 5 years that says it's prima facie evidence of an unfair labor practice if a company that's producing in a union state moves to a right-to-work state. This is an assault on every middle-income Tennessean and on millions of middle-income Americans who have manufacturing jobs. Certainly in every one of the 22 right-to-work states, but as the Boeing chief executive said, it could be just as much of a disincentive to a state like Michigan or Illinois or some other state that does not have a right-to-work law, because why would you put a plant in Michigan if later you wouldn't be allowed to put it in Tennessee? If General Motors has plants in both right-to-work and non-right-to-work states. So we're going to make it more difficult for General Motors to expand in America. So where are they going to expand? They can expand overseas. They can be making there what they sell there instead of making it here. Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle like to talk about outsourcing jobs. This is the mother of all outsourcing jobs plans. The idea that it's prima facie evidence for a company that expands in a right-to-work state that that's an unfair labor practice. So, Madam President, for the next 2 to 5 years, we have the unhealthy situation for jobs that any manufacturer who wants to expand will have to think twice about expanding in a right-to-work state and then think at least once about coming in the first place to a state that doesn't have a right-to-work law. And the only other option I can see for those jobs is to make them overseas. That will not only slow job growth in the United States where we desperately need it, but it will be speeding up the sending of American jobs overseas. Madam President, I ask consent to place in the record 2 articles, one by George Will this week on the South Carolina Boeing plant and the action of the National Labor Relations Board complaint, and the second, an article from The Economist magazine.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. And I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
consent the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection?
I ask consent that the quorum call time be equally divided.
Without objection?
I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President, I ask that